So once again, go to October Daily Participation and click on Resubmit, and a text box will open up, and type in the three significant things from today. And so let's talk about justice in the world, or international justice. And just briefly go over other countries and how their systems work. So obviously, there's going to be minor differences from country to country, but many countries use a Western system that we talked about here in class and that you've seen on TV shows and movies a number of times: judge, jury, certain amount of rights, prosecutor, defense, and so on. The question is, in any other country, though, besides, of course, some legal technicalities that leave some minor detail differences. Two topics would be cultural influence, for instance. So cultural influence, and that can be religious based or some other type of cultural system. For instance, in some but not all Muslim majority countries, religion has a great influence over the justice system. And the other one would be corruption. How serious is the criminal justice system? Is this just a way of getting people that the government doesn't like, or is it actually a fair, just system? Yes.
Can you still get like stoned to death?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Was that like Saudi Arabia?
Not necessarily. No. Some of the rural areas of Afghanistan and Pakistan, in particular, those are usually not enacted by government institutions. Though that's completed by local authorities of people that are considered elders in the community, and usually through some type of mob justice, where the group feels angry about something, so they take action in those particular type of circumstances. It can happen often in rural areas of India would be another one, and there are probably other places that we don't keep track of. For instance, maybe like in the Amazon, where it might still occur. So yes, that still happens in some places, and so that, of course, is separate from the criminal justice system. That's just based on mob mentality and local culture completely. And if the government does find out about that, especially if there's international outrage, the government will, of course, go after people that took vengeance themselves or carried out some type of act in particular. But anyway, as for the international system, we've had an idea for international justice going back, of course, to medieval times when countries would settle disputes. But really, the first formal attempt would be during the League of Nations, which existed in between World War I and World War II. They had their own judicial system in particular, but obviously the League of Nations, especially without the United States as a member, had no teeth, and therefore even their justice system was mostly on paper and not had any practical implications for the world. At the end of World War II, we did have a situation, though, where many crimes had been committed that involved multiple countries, especially victims, in both Germany and Japan. And so after the World War II, at the winding down months, and then afterwards in Nuremberg, the trials would occur, commonly called the Nuremberg trials, over Nazi leaders and military officials for their possible crimes against humanity. And it was a court system made up of judges from the United States, France, Britain, and Russia, where they came together to present cases. Prosecutors and defense attorneys would be sent from these countries on behalf of the suspects and tried before the judges as a panel, basically, to decide whether or not they were guilty and what type of punishment there should be. Some of them, of course, would result in executions. Others would be for long-term prison sentences. And there was a concern, of course, about the fairness of the trial, and also whether or not people were being scapegoated for the decisions of others. But of course, there were safeguards put into place, and maybe there's one or two that were carried out in a harsh or unfair manner. But for the most part, many people feel that the trials were a success. Also, a counterpart to them would be in Tokyo, commonly called the Tokyo trials, but also there's a longer phrase that includes International Court for the Far East or something like that. But the Tokyo trials also took place. They get a lot less attention in history because we don't really think of the Japanese carrying out things like the Nazis did. But in fact, there are quite a few people put on trial there as well, both as government officials and military officials. Historically, we often just think of the harsh treatment of American prisoners of war, for instance, in the Philippines, but actually is much more extensive than that. Japanese military police, particularly their scientific officers, carried out similar experiments to the Nazis. In fact, some of them quite horrific. And also the treatment of the Chinese and Koreans was under review by this justice system as well. And so basically it worked the same way as Nuremberg, prosecution, defense, judges from the different allied countries, and so on. And it was carried out right after the war. After these happened, of course, there were questions about what should we do when it comes to international justice in the future. We can all agree that there were some bad actors in both of these situations in Germany and in Japan. But what about going forward if something like this happens again, or if there's further disputes between countries? And so there are two international courts that exist. The International Court of Justice is an official part of the United Nations, and they have a panel of judges that are chosen by the UN, and no more than one judge can be from a particular country. Their main job, and there's not really a huge amount of controversy over the existence of this particular court, their job is to settle disputes between countries in particular. And the United States is a willing participant in this organization. So border disputes, treaty issues, trade, those kinds of things can all come before them. Although there is a different organization that deals mostly with trade in particular. But the International Court of Justice is meant there to help hopefully settle disputes so that way they don't grow into conflicts in particular. The question is, of course, does it really do an effective job, since obviously there have been conflicts that have occurred in the world, and do they really have any consequences, for instance, for following through with whatever type of ruling they give? They could say, well, these two countries, A and B, have to recognize this is their border and they can't really send people across unless it's peacefully. But then who's going to make them follow through with that? And so that's one of the issues with the International Court of Justice. The other one is much more controversial. The International Criminal Court was kind of a successor to the justice system that existed at Nuremberg and Tokyo. And it is specifically, basically, what is included in the title, a criminal court. It prosecutes people for crimes, especially individuals that have committed gross acts against humanity, particularly in multiple countries or on behalf of one country against another. And so some of the more barbaric acts that have taken place, for instance, in the war in the Balkans involving the former Yugoslavia, there have been individuals brought before the International Criminal Court for that. The problem is, once again, do they have jurisdiction is the big question. And how much power do they have? And so not all countries belong to it. Almost all of Latin America, about half of Africa, for instance, belongs to it. Europe belongs to it. But many other parts of the world do not. The United States is one of the countries that does not belong to the International Criminal Court. And our main objection to it, of course, is that we have jurisdiction over our own people, and if we commit crimes or any of our people commit crimes, then we will prosecute them and take care of them within our own criminal justice system. The idea, of course, is national sovereignty, that a country has to control its own laws, its own systems of governance, and so on, and that no one else can interfere with that. So that's why the United States and other countries do not participate. Of course, unless we do participate, then the criticism is we have no right to complain if there is someone that is committing gross acts against humanity. We have no real right to insist that they be prosecuted or be taken to this court in the meantime. So because we're not a participant, basically the criticism is we can't participate in that international criminal system of justice in any way possible. So that is just a kind of a nutshell of what goes on in the world, especially on the world stage when it comes to criminal justice.